Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to the B2B Growth Show, a podcast dedicated to helping B2B executives achieve explosive growth. Whether you're looking for techniques and strategies or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. I'm Jonathan Green.
And I'm James Carberry.
Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. This episode is sponsored by Directive Consulting, the B2B search marketing agency. Today we are joined by Ryan Wedig. Ryan is the co-founder and CEO at PrinterLogic. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for carving out some time for us today. We're going to be talking about this idea of focusing on company growth, but through metrics and mentorship, which I think is a very unique, very fascinating topic. But Ryan, before we get into today's topic, maybe you can tell us a little about what you and the PrinterLogic team are up to these days.
You bet. So PrinterLogic, the original founder, they go clear back to the Novell days. So before Microsoft really took off in the networking space, the original founder had come up with a way to really solve for some of the challenges with print management in the early networks. As things migrated away from Novell into the Microsoft space, we created some migration tools and eventually created a platform that could eliminate the need for print servers altogether. And if you're in a small business or a very large business with the enterprise experience, just as an end user, getting the right printer when you come into a building and being able to print, it can just be a real challenge. I mean, it's super simple if you're talking about some USB printers that you plug in, but as soon as you get network printers and you're having lots of people share them, it gets complicated. So what PrinterLogic does is for that end user, we make their experience really just, you walk into a room, we know what printers you have. We have badge scan release print jobs for security. We have mobile printing. We can tell you who printed what, when, and where. But we can do all of that without the print server. So on the back end for the admin, it makes their job a lot easier. And all of the CIOs that are trying to say, hey, let's get all of this infrastructure out of the branch locations and simplify everything, get it to the cloud. We help fulfill that on the back end. So there's a really nice ROI from the business perspective and a super beneficial productivity gains from the individual's perspective. And that's kind of that's how we've evolved. I have been a consultant with PrinterLogic for going clear back to the early days, back to 2002, on and off at different times. But in 2012, we decided, the original founder said, I need to take this to the next level. It's basically me, and I have some independent contractors, developer, and that's the size of the company. But when he really got to the point where he felt good about the product and was ready to launch it, he said, I need a true business partner in here to come in and blow this thing up. And so we had a great conversation. We came to terms with, what does equity look like? What does the partnership look like? And how do we go from him running a lifestyle business and converting that mindset over and into, no, we're creating a corporation, and the value is not going to be, the number of dollars in the piggy bank of the company. The value is going to be in how do we grow this thing into something special. And so there was kind of that's where I come in as kind of a co-founder, at that moment in late 2012. And we've grown from the two of us in a room, trying to figure out what is our core value proposition in that moment to over 170 employees. We have offices across the globe. We've opened up and done a pretty good job of entering the EMEA market and looking to expand into Asia Pac via Australia this year. So it's gotten pretty sophisticated pretty quickly, and it's been a wild ride.
That's fantastic, and congratulations sincerely on your growth. I was going to mention, if you didn't, that obviously PrinterLogic has grown incredibly over the last several years, and it's one of the reasons that we're lucky to have you on the show today to talk about how you can focus on company growth, but through metrics and mentorship. And you've got some real world examples. I mean, you've you've been through it. You've been in the trenches. And so we love having real world examples. We love having people who have, been there, getting their hands dirty, seeing it through. So Ryan, why don't we start then with this idea of mentors and kind of how they play a role?
You bet. For me, mentors they're just part of my DNA. They're how I grew up. I played a lot of sports, so coaches were important to me, but outside of sports, inside church, there were always a lot of key people who just taught me more than I could have figured out on my own, right? And I always tell people kind of culturally, guys, we can learn more in 5 minutes by listening to somebody than it would take us 5 years to learn that same experience. So let's take advantage of that. Let's actively go after and seek after mentors. And when we first got going, Jarrett and we would take a trip every month up. We're down in little old St. George. I mean, it's a town. It's growing fast. It's one of the fastest growing. It is the fastest growing metro area in the nation right now. So it's exciting. But when we got here 5 years ago, it was pretty sleepy still, and we weren't seeing that same kind of growth. But we were going up north because what had happened was as Novell kind of split apart and lots of really cool technology companies were splintering off of that. The Salt Lake area and the Ogden, Salt Lake, Provo area were starting to attract quite a bit of venture capital. And so there were lots of great stories going on left and right. And so we purposefully carved time out to travel 4 to 5 hours up north once a month just to meet and network and find out how in the world these guys were making these cool startups happen. Mm-hmm. And it was a really interesting journey. I mean, you would meet people who wanted to, you guys look like you're smart and you have something going, and they kind of wanted to commandeer it and take it over and, be the smart guy in the room. So you kind of had to be careful of them. You had people who saw that you were making just enough money that they could siphon a little bit off for themselves, right? And so you had to be careful of those guys, and they didn't really have a lot to offer. But then you had this really, and the majority of the folks that we made the time to go and meet with, they were just this rich culture of people that have been in our exact same shoes. And it was always amazing, the attitude of paying it forward. They just incredible group of folks that would carve out a lunch or, carve out a little time in the afternoon just to tell their stories about the battle scars that they've acquired, how they acquired them, and just really important lessons early on. I think one of the other things that happens is it's really important at an early stage to build out not necessarily a full-blown board. Wait until you're bringing on investment and getting crazy and all that stuff to bring on a full-blown board, because there's a whole other set of dynamics that happen even with the best of boards that you've got to be prepared for, and it puts a lot of overhead onto the company. But one of the things you can do really early on without all that trauma and drama is to actively, while you're trying to meet these folks that have been there and done that, is try to figure out who believes in you enough to become a member of your advisory board. And we had some great people come on really early on that just the company didn't look like much, right? Like it was this straggly toothed little kid showing up and saying, hey, we just want a little bit of your time. But after you kiss 40 toads, one or two of them filter out and they say, I think you guys, I'll bet on the jockey on this one, right? And so those advisors just became really, really crucial to the development as we got more sophisticated to be able to punch above our weight and see things coming. I think one of the best examples was an early advisory board member who he said, Ryan, one of the things you got to be really careful as you build this out is with your marketing team, because one of the first things that's going to happen with the marketing team is they're going to say, feed me, see more. And that will be kind of their rule of thumb. And the problem is, as you feed it, and they're always saying in the future you're going to see more, you can run out of money before the more comes. Right. And I had a really early on as a consultant with Jarrett, I had an experience where I kind of ran into this head first, and that was, Jarrett said, I remember him coming into the office one day. You know, he was very much on the technical side, right? And I was kind of on the business development side. So he came in one day and he said, Ryan, this is a tech rag. All of the people that are involved with Novell, they're interested in this tech rag. They read this tech rag. I think we should advertise in it. So I say, sure, no problem. I give him a call and say, hey, how do we become, you know, a sponsor here and get some ads? They said, well, it's $60,000. Now, at the time, this is going back even when it was a lifestyle business. I mean, I don't know if we were making $300,000-$400,000 a year, and it was supporting, you know, him, my consulting fees, and some support engineers, right? Like we weren't just flush with cash. $60,000 from a marketing perspective, that meant a lot of dollars. But I said, well, if that's what the big boys do, let's do it. So we launched this campaign, and I remember 6 months go by, and Jarrett and I are having a meeting, and he says, well, what happened to that $60,000? And I said, I don't know, Jarrett. And it was kind of like that old adage, you know, I know 50% of our marketing is working. I just don't know which 50%. So if it was that or another 60,000 that we spent somewhere, you know, it was just like a really bad feeling to have that be a response. Yeah. And in the digital age where we were comparing that kind of traction against the traction of, you know, being able to tag a link with the banner ads we were doing, I mean, it just didn't feel good. And so, you know, there's some examples of the topics that we're talking about today. You've got the mentor on the one hand, as you get going, saying, be careful of the marketing, feed me, see more strategy. And then I've got this past experience of like, that was like one of those open wounds that never really healed. I always remembered, and it always seemed to be down there bleeding. Because I just said, you know, in this era, there's too many marketing activities we should be doing before we get into air cover. And I don't even know when and how you arrive at air cover, because it's a digital world and we should be able to track this stuff. So when I came back in 2012 and we start to get these advisors and we start to work on, you know, what is the culture of this business going to be like? That's something we weren't necessarily actively saying, how do we write down what is our culture going to be like? But certainly we were saying, in our minds, what is our strategy? How do we behave? One of the most top of mind items I had in my head is that whole $60,000 poof will never happen again. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, having an advisor remind me that when we put our marketing together, we need to make sure we don't bleed out the company before we see results, and that, you know, me having that experience to say, I'm going to make darn sure that every single thing that we do is going to be tracked, and we're going to know about it, and we're going to know what's successful. It paid out huge dividends. What it did is it put us if you're going to do that, you have to make some investments up front, right? So instead of going with some rinky-dink CRM, we call up Salesforce, and we're saying, hey, there's only 2 of us, but we want the best enterprise license you got, because that's the only thing that will help us track the way we want to track. Wow. And they're kind of like not even wanting to give you the time of day. They say, well, it's a minimum of 5 licenses. and so like literally that's what we did. We said, okay, well, I mean, if we need these features to track those other 3 licenses that we're going to have to pay for and we don't have people to fill the seats on, we want to start developing and laying the foundation and the infrastructure right now to be able to track these metrics in the future. Salesforce is the tool to do it. It has the ecosystem that'll allow us to do it. Now, this is not a pitch for Salesforce. I mean, that's just CRM 6 years ago that we thought was best. There's probably plenty of other better solutions, and other people can talk about that. But for us in that moment, paying the extra dollars to get the support that we needed to track the metrics, like we felt like that was the best platform. So the point is that we totally overpaid, not which platform did we go with. And it was a decision that a year later, the type of information that we were getting, because we went to that first year, we probably went to 13 we went to our first trade show in December of 2012, and by the next year we did probably, I think, 14, 15 trade shows.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of that year, we could go back and say we knew exactly how many leads we got from each trade show. We knew exactly what the conversion rate from lead to demo was, and we knew exactly what the conversion rate from demo to trial was, and exactly what the conversion rate from trial to close was. And obviously, we had to have we had limited data set. So at the time, you kind of had to play games with, have we given this enough time to close to even know if it's valuable information and all those kinds of things. But we were able to extrapolate a year later, do we go to that show again or not? And I think a lot of small companies without that data end up, because you can go to a show and feel like you just had incredible reaction from the people for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, they might not be the actual buying center. They might not be responsible for the ROI that's needed to justify the purchase. There's a lot of reasons why you can get really positive feedback, feel like it was a successful show, and then a year later realize you haven't made a single dollar off that show. And we were able to very quickly react to the kind of the conversion rates because we were tracking that so tight. Mm-hmm. And it's just, now as you grow up, I'm using marketing as an example, but we use these same principles in finance, in HR, in sales, like that mindset of having conversations with some folks that have been there and done that, figuring out what are the KPIs, what are the metrics that really matter, and then building out the infrastructure early on, even though it might seem like a high cost, to be able to make good decisions later. Like all of that, I think was a huge factor of our success in being able to, bootstrap from, the two people in a shared office space kind of yelling at each other to what we've become. It's all about those metrics and those mentors guiding us along the way.
All right, it's story time again, and today I'm going to tell you about a challenge within Pelican Case's B2B division. Now, Pelican needed a partner with deep B2B expertise that could get them a massive bump in leads from their pay-per-click campaigns without increasing spend. After vetting a handful of agencies, they decided to go with Directive Consulting, a B2B search marketing agency located in Southern California. Directive took on this challenge by refining their targeting and building custom landing pages for their advertising efforts. Once implemented, they saw a 208% increase in conversion rate. And needless to say, Pelican Cases met their initiative. I have a hunch that Directive can get these kind of results for you too. So head over to directiveconsulting.com and request a totally free custom proposal. That's directiveconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to this interview.
So two things kind of come to mind as I was listening to that story. Number one, for any of our younger listeners, the Feed Me Seymour reference, go check out Little Shop of Horrors. You have to see it. It's a great movie. Number two is, when it comes to taking advantage of mentors, mentorship, like you said, I mean, they might be the ones who have this experience. You can get that experience by paying attention. They understand the KPIs and the metrics that maybe matter. But is there, in your experience, since we have you on the show, is there, I don't know, a balance between listening to your mentors, sort of taking advantage of the things that they know, but also being open to the way that things have changed and changed so rapidly and so aggressively that, certain metrics or KPIs that they think are important are maybe not necessarily as important anymore, and how do you determine where that line is?
So I would say this. There's a really good book that I recommend to anybody who's trying to start to get to the point where they're building out their leadership team and saying, who's my partner going to be, and these kinds of things. As you get into that stage, it's a book by Ben Horowitz called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And one of the things that he cautions about is be really careful about getting people into the organization too early on that have been in massive organizations in the past. Like say somebody has been a super duper VP at HP or IBM or at Cisco, right? Like those are all, sometimes they're incredible people that have just like great experience and they've been entrepreneurs and somehow they ended up in that space. But more times than not, their experience will tend to be, I joined Cisco out of college. I went through this really cool training program and I've worked my way up over the last 40 years or 30 years or whatever. And I've kind of like become the thing that I've become. Right. So, one of the things Ben says is, there's a time and a place for those guys, but if you bring them in too early, their reaction to every problem is kind of like, well, I know how I did this piece of the puzzle that I owned in my big place, and I want to set up infrastructure, and I want to hire people, and I want to, I want to rebuild my kingdom, and then I can make sure that we're all successful. Like that's probably the worst thing that you can do. And so the reason why I bring up that example is when we talk about the mentors, and I said you're going to kiss 40 toads before you find the two that you're saying, hey, these are the guys that get it and that get me and that I want to be engaged with. That's like a really important piece of the puzzle not to forget, right? The people that we brought in, they didn't have time to join our company. Like these were not people who saying, oh, I see a chance to make a job for myself. Mm-hmm. In fact, these were people who were actively engaged in their own battles. They just have had 20 or 30 years worth of battles ahead of us, and they were in even more sophisticated things than we were doing. So I think you're bringing up a really important point. We're not talking like your mentors cannot be corporate creatures. That's not what I'm suggesting, right? And they can't be people who have been out to pasture for 20 years. These mentors that we end up selecting are the real deal who either have just barely finished an amazing career and they're wanting to kind of stay engaged and give back, and so it's all fresh in their minds, or they're folks that are actively engaged and they're playing with the idea of someday they might want to be on a board, or they might already be on some boards and they see you as a company that they could see themselves being on the board down the road. Like these are people that are actively engaged in the game, and it's a real privilege to get their time. But the other key thing is if they make you feel like it's a privilege to get their time, you should feel that, right? You should feel that gratitude and that humility for their time. But if they make you feel that way, that's not a good advisor either. They should make you feel like they feel privileged to be part of this special moment of the company. Mm-hmm. And so those are some of the things that you're really looking for, and I can't emphasize enough. Like we kissed 40 toads before we brought 2 advisors on because they hit that sweet spot.
That's a really interesting point about finding the right match, the right mentor, and the one that doesn't make you feel like they're doing you this huge, incredible favor, that they're also excited to be a part of it because of what they see in you. So that's fantastic. Being very discriminating with, who you bring on, who you learn from, all fantastic advice. So, Ryan, speaking of sort of mentorship, speaking of success stories, and speaking of, being on the battlefield and having this experience, Ryan, one of the things that we've been asking our guests in 2018 especially is, at the end of the day, Ryan, what kind of legacy are you hoping to leave behind? Whether that's personal, professional, or even a combination of the two.
Well, I would say, and I talk to my executive team and even the folks that aren't part of the executive team all the time about, as fun as it is putting PrinterLogic together, it's kind of like, as you build a company, it's kind of like building your family, right? Like you have your kids, and this is not to equate my employees to my kids at all, but I have 5 kids, so I just look at them and I'm saying, it's so cool. I love hanging out with you right now while you're 8 years old, or you're 12 years old, or you're 6 years old. Like I love all these phases, but I cannot wait until you're like full blown adult out there doing your own thing. And just to see what is your potential, what does it become, And I think that as you as you get into the business and you start building this business and you surround yourself with these guys and these gals that are peers, and like in so many ways you see them as intellectually far superior, right? Like their IQs are off the charts, or their grit is off the chart, and you're just somewhere in between of all of these things. And but you're giving them this experience, like in St. George, it's a small town, right? So there's been a ton of potential that's been sitting here doing things that were not as creative or not as exciting or meaningful to them. And then you create this tech company and you attract this incredible talent into your organization, and they start to learn and see how you scale up and how you do all these things. So you can just see it. I'm just like 5 years from now to see what all of these folks go on to do. I can't even wait 5-10 years from now to see them go off, make their own businesses, do their own things, and potentially have them point back and say, PrinterLogic was the place we learned how to do a lot of these things. Like that would be an awesome legacy. And then I think the second piece would be being in a smaller town from a community standpoint. We have a really great example of this. There's one other. The hospital's done some great things in the area, but there's a company called SkyWest, and they started as a little tiny rinky-dink bunch of guys trying to figure out how to fly people in and out of St. George, and a lot of people flying on Delta, United, US Air, on any of these regional flights. They have 30,000 employees coming out of little old St. George, Utah, and they kind of changed the face of what's possible. And to maybe be able to make it into that club of, hey, PrinterLogic introduced this other industry and made this town have something that it didn't have before. That would be a really sweet legacy if we can pull that off as a company as well.
That would be sweet indeed. So, well, we definitely wish you continued growth and success with PrinterLogic. It sounds like St. George is up and coming, so that's fantastic as well. We've been talking with Ryan Wedig. Ryan, if anyone in our audience, if any of our listeners, they want to find out more about today's episode, they want to find out more about PrinterLogic, they want to just connect with you in some way, what is the best way for them to go about doing that?
Yeah, probably the best way, just CEO@printerlogic.com. That'll get to me, and happy to answer any questions or work with them on anything that they're trying to work through at the early stages. That's a fun time to be, and love to share any pointers that I can share along the way.
That's fantastic. Well, and thank you for sharing those pointers with us here on the episode today. It was a pleasure having you on the show, Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks for giving us some time.
There are lots of ways to build a community, and we've chosen to build the B2B growth community through this podcast. But because of the way podcasts work, it's really hard to engage with our listeners. And without engagement, it's tough to build a great community. So here's what we've decided to do. We're organizing small dinners across the country with our listeners and guests. No sales pitches, no agenda, just great conversations with like-minded people. We'll talk business, we'll talk family, we'll talk goals and dreams. We'll build friendships. So if you'd like to be a part of a B2B growth dinner in a city near you, go to b2bgrowthdinners.com. That's b2bgrowthdinners.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.